Welcome to Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania and a special edition of The World Today. My name is Michael Horowitz, and I am Richard Perry Professor and Director of Perry Worldhouse. For those of you joining us for the first time, Perry Worldhouse is UPenn's hub for global policy engagement, and our focus is on connecting academic insights to the real world in the global policy space. And as part of our mission, we provide analysis on breaking news, drawing on expertise from UPenn and the policy world. For example, we already published an explainer on what's going on in Syria, authored by Dr. Mara Karlin of Johns Hopkins SAIS, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities, and a visiting fellow this year at Perry Worldhouse. You can access it on our webpage, where you can also join our mailing list to find out about all of our upcoming events and activities. I'll be moderating today's conversation about what just happened halfway around the world in Syria, and really pleased that we have three tremendous speakers today to make us smart about that situation. Richard Fontaine is CEO of the Center for New American Security, a think tank in Washington, D.C., and the Woke Visiting Fellow this year at Perry Worldhouse. Marie Harf is the Executive Director of Perry Worldhouse, worked on issues in the Middle East, in the State Department, and the U.S. intelligence community in a prior life. And Brendan O'Leary is the Lauder Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, and has spent decades working with and advising Kurdish groups in the region. I'll turn it over to the speakers in a moment, but before I begin, a few logistical notes. Following the conversation, we'll open the discussion up to questions that have been received from the audience, both audience in Zoom. To ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom interface in the middle. With that out of the way, why don't we get started? First, I want to ask each of the panelists the following question, because I'll be honest, this was not on my bingo card for late November, early December 2024. What just happened in Syria? Were you expecting it? And yeah, why did we get such tremendous change so quickly? Why don't we start with Richard, then go to Brendan, and then to Marie?
Great. Well, after 13 years of civil war and more than 50 years of Assad family rule and Alawite rule in Syria, it's all over. At least for now. The rebels marched down city to city in under 2 weeks, took over Aleppo, Homs, Hama, other major cities, and marched into Damascus. And Bashar al-Assad, who many rebels supported by many different outside powers had been fighting over the years to remove from power, apparently got on a plane and now is living in Moscow with his family. So he has fled the country. There's a new government, a Salvation Front, as they're calling it, that has just met this morning with the existing Syrian cabinet. So to say these things are surprising and astonishing, I think would be putting it mildly. The U.S. government had been seeing some things sort of moving over the past couple of weeks, but the speed with which all of this happened seems to have been a shock to people in Syria, to the Iranians, to observers in other places as well. I went to Syria for the first time exactly 25 years ago, 1999. And even then, you could feel just how oppressive the police state there was. This was under Hafez al-Assad, before Bashar had come into power, how calcified and corrupt the regime appeared at the time. And all these years later, it seems only to have deteriorated, but there was nothing that could finally push it out of power until this crack. So why did it crack? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, the Turks, who had been supporting some of the rebel factions, encouraged them and with financing and other things to make a move, given the broader geopolitical environment in the Middle East right now. That broader geopolitical environment means Hezbollah has been damaged extraordinarily badly after Israeli attacks. And so Hezbollah, which had propped up on the ground the Assad regime in Lebanon, was unable to do so. Iran had a smaller number of forces on the ground and was either unwilling or unable to throw them into the fight for a Syrian military that was abandoning its positions. And then finally, the Russians, who had used extraordinary amounts of air power to bomb sites and positions previously, did a bit of that, but then basically stopped. And so Assad turned out to be much weaker and have much less support, particularly when his external supporters weren't at his back than had been the case before. And it's worth saying, as of right now, the scenes in Damascus are. You see the opening of the major prison there that held these political prisoners, some for decades, known as the slaughterhouse. I mean, extraordinarily brutal places, and the sort of joy and delight on the streets of Damascus. There's still fighting going on. Israel destroyed the Syrian Navy earlier today, has bombed more than 300 sites, military depots, and equipment across the country. The United States, 2 days ago, carried out more than 3 dozen strikes on ISIS sites, and now the Turkish proxy militia in the north is fighting the U.S. Favored Kurdish militia in the north. So the story is still being written, but it's an amazing one.
Brendan?
I agree with what Richard has just said. I would emphasize that regimes like this are not removed by the peoples they preside over. Usually they're far too strong and far too repressive. This was a Ba'athist dictatorship that rested fundamentally on the Alawite community. It presented itself as a secular pan-Arab party and movement, but in fact that masked an ethnic dictatorship. We saw the regime fall fundamentally because its external support was removed. And that external support was vital for propping it up for over 10 to 13 years. It's fairly clear that when the Iranians and the Russians came in, they thought the regime's army and defense forces were fairly useless. They attempted to reorganize them. And what we've just seen is that the removal of that external support has allowed the regime to collapse extraordinarily quickly. One of the reasons it did collapse, it was partly because it was so corrupt and it lost control of its own officialdom and all of its units. It had done something that regimes do when they're in trouble. It had diversified its military into multiple militias, some of which were more effective than the official army. But in the end, all that proved ineffective. I think it's vital that while people celebrate the removal of this appalling regime, that they not be far too optimistic. Syria is a binational place. There are two nations there, Kurds and Arabs. It's multi-religious. There are Sunni, Shia, Christians, Druze, and others, a whole range of micro-minorities. There are multiple militias. This is not one army displacing another, and they're spread all over the territory. And Syria is deeply territorially penetrated. Israel has occupied the Golan Heights, as most people know, but it's also expanded beyond the Golan Heights. The Russians have a base in Tartus. They'll want to try and keep that on the coast. The Turks have carried out ethnic expulsions in Afrin, where they expelled the Kurdish population, and they are a key force in supporting the currently successful insurgents, as Richard emphasized. And then in the northeast, you have a so far relatively successful Kurdish movement, which seeks territorial autonomy. So if you put all that together, that's a very, very seriously perplexed place in which finding accommodation, let alone democratic stabilization, will be very difficult.
Marie?
I'm not sure I understand.
I don't know if anyone else heard that Siri in the background, but thank you to everyone who joined today. My apologies. I'm getting over a little cold, so I will try and keep my voice up as much as possible. I think one of the things we've all touched on is this, I think, truism that often usually holds, which is that autocracies crack very slowly. And you can see the cracks and you can see the fissures, but when they finally fall, it tends to happen pretty quickly. And Richard's right. There were people in DC, some inside government, some outside government, who were seeing some of these cracks over the past few weeks and months. And then in a very, very rapid amount of time, when as Brendan said, the external support just collapsed. The end came very quickly. Because of my background in the US government, I tend to look at these situations and ask the question about US policy. What was it? Was it helpful? Was it not helpful? Did it matter? Did it not? And I think a lot of us in Washington, where I used to live, have a tendency to see everything as a US story, or to try and figure out what the US story is. And I think to a large extent,
Isn't it always about us?
no, that I wasn't referring to you specifically, Mike, but I'm glad that you felt as if I was, having just returned to Philly from Washington, from the Pentagon, which is the epicenter of that, that. But I think there are a couple points I want to make about that specific piece of this, starting in the president and working backwards. So first, both Richard and Brendan talked about Iran and Hezbollah and their inability or unwillingness to protect the Assad regime. The reason, in large part, Russia was unwilling or unable to is because the US and other allies have dragged them down in Ukraine, that they have committed so many resources to Ukraine because of our and others' efforts to support the Ukrainians, that they did not have the same amount of support left to give the Assad regime. I mean, there are reports that the Russians were so surprised also that, I mean, they have soldiers still there, they have bases there, they have a lot of equities there that I think they are very rapidly trying to figure out what to do with next. Going back a bit, though, it was interesting. I was at the State Department last night. I worked for Secretary Kerry, and we unveiled his portrait. They do this every 4 years. And he gave a speech, and in it he said, "It's amazing that there are so many people who worked for Barack Obama and Joe Biden in this room only a few days after the Assad regime fell. Because we spent days and weeks and months trying to eke out some kind of diplomatic solution to parts of this conflict." I was at the UN when we got the resolution that took almost all of the known stockpile of chemical weapons out of Syria after they had used them on their own people. After the infamous red line comment, a policy decision I fully support still and am happy to debate with people. And remember, having to tell Congress in 2015 that the goal by the end of the year was training and equipping 5,000 Syrian, quote, moderate fighters to fight ISIS. And at that point, the Pentagon said that we had trained 4 or 5 that were in the field, 4 or 5 out of 5,000, right? So when you look at a decade plus of US policy in this incredibly important conflict, in this incredibly important region, and importantly, what lessons we take from that going forward, I think there were a lot of things we tried to do that ultimately, at the time we did them, did not help get us to where we are today with this rapidly disintegrating regime of Bashar al-Assad. But I think there are pieces of that, including and especially what we've done in Ukraine, that I think give us some lessons going forward. I think the biggest lesson I take away from all of this is if we had done something back at the start of the uprising, it may not have taken quite so long. And that's probably the biggest regret I have, having served in that administration, that when we had more of an opportunity to do more damage, we did not do so. So I think I will stop there, Mike, and turn it back over to you.
So let me pick up something that all of you mentioned in one way or another, which is the extent to which, in some ways, why this happened so quickly, and the extent to which this depended on other things going on in the world. So is this in some ways a victory for the Biden administration's policy in the Middle East, or policy in Ukraine? Or, how should we be thinking about this in the context of U.S. foreign policy, and what do the implications look like for the region? So really two questions there. Why don't we start with, why don't we go Brendan, Marie, Richard this time?
So I don't think we can claim that the Biden administration had as a direct goal regime replacement or collapse, though it is true that Syria has been under sustained economic sanctions for a very long time. So if you want to count it in some long-run sense as a victory for US policy, one can do so. I doubt you can, and I think Mari's point about the possibilities of an earlier intervention ring true to me. What I think I would add to her point about Russia's withdrawal of support from the regime is little known behind the radar. The Russians were making serious efforts to try and get the Assad regime to accommodate not only the enormous Sunni Arab majority in the country as a whole, but also to try and get them to make a deal with the Kurds. And the regime refused to do that. It wanted, as a precondition for any settlement, for all foreign powers to withdraw from the country. It offered the Kurds, who wanted territorial autonomy of some kind, a mere local administration. And the Russians basically got deeply impatient with the Assad regime. They saw no prospect of it coming to terms with its constituent peoples. I use the word plural, peoples, advisedly. And that's one reason they pulled the rug under him. The interesting question is whether they did this in quick desperation, or whether they did it in a considered way. Will they be able to hold on to the base on the grounds that they have an international treaty giving them that base? Will they reinforce it militarily? It would be a very severe blow to the Russians if they were to lose that base.
Marie?
Picking up on that, I will steal a term that Richard coined with a colleague at CNAS, the axis of upheaval, that refers to China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And I think I bring that up because there's been so much talk about all of these autocracies and others working together and supporting each other, and North Korean troops fighting with Russians in Ukraine, and Iranian drones being used in Ukraine. You know, there's all these military to military ties. We see it across these countries and others. On the flip side of that, when they start to feel pressured, all of those contributed to the downfall of Assad. That there was not one pain point, there were many pain points. And there's a lot of consternation in Washington about the success that these countries have had in working together. But the flip side is true. They're putting a lot of eggs in each other's baskets right now. And when that basket starts to crack, we saw that here. I think in terms of its, there are pieces of it that are a success for a number of different players here. I think the Trump incoming team and the Biden team are both trying to claim pieces of success here. And in some ways, their policies do not appear to be that far apart.
Everybody always wants a win.
Everybody always wants a win. I think that one of the key things I'm watching, and we'll get to the future in a minute, but sometimes what look like wins turn out not to be. And what comes next really matters. And a lot of us have lived through previous, quote, wins where Gaddafi is taken out, Saddam is taken out, right? There's the succession of we get wins, and then what? And I think we'll get to that in a second, but I hesitate to put any wins on the board at this point, except looking at these videos of Syrians streaming back over the border. For those of us who worked on, and care about the Syrian refugee crisis, it's really hard not to feel so much joy for them and hope for them, which I know, and there's not a lot of joy and hope going around right now. And neither of those are foreign policy theories to bet your house on, but it's a nice moment.
If I could just add, in terms of winners, there's no question that President Erdogan of Turkey regards this as a win for himself. Whether it'll be a poisoned chalice is another matter. It looks like a triumph for the neo-Ottoman policy of his party and indeed his personal sets of ambitions. And for the short run, it also looks like a win for Israel. Not only have they apparently dealt a very, very serious, if not mortal blow to Hezbollah, they have seen the disappearance of a sworn enemy of Israel. But of course, they're deeply worried about the repercussions, and that's one reason why they've embarked on the very adventurous military policy of extinguishing what's left of the official forces of Syria.
Richard.
Yeah, I think of any of the external powers, Israel and Turkey should get more of the credit, I guess you could say, than the United States or even Russia here. I mean, without
We actually have a question in the chat with somebody asking, Netanyahu said he's responsible for the fall of Assad.
in part, I mean, that was not obviously the only thing that contributed, but if Hezbollah were able to fight and protect the Assad regime in Syria, it may have survived. But it was unable to do so because of Israel's destruction of large quantities of its military material and people. And so that was a severe blow to the position there. I don't think this was Netanyahu's intent, but he was right when he talked about the chain reaction that started on October 7th with the Hamas attack on Israel that has ended in the destruction of the Assad regime in Syria and also extremely severe blows both to Hamas, Hezbollah, and to the Iranian regime itself. So that's all correct. It's worth saying, though, that the person who is most responsible for all this is Bashar al-Assad himself. I mean, Brendan mentioned this, and it hasn't gotten as much attention, but it wasn't just the Russians being drawn away to fight in Ukraine that was at issue here. It was their unwillingness and exasperation with Assad because he would not take a single opportunity that had been offered to him over the past few years. Regional normalization with other Arab countries. All he wanted to do was exhort them to get the U.S. to lift sanctions. A deal with the Sunnis, a deal with the Kurds. He wasn't interested. He was more interested in using, as his family always had, the country as his own personal piggy bank, looting everything it had, selling Captagon, this drug, throughout the region. So it became essentially a narco state, and that's how they made their money. And then enriching himself. And you had, once the military side of things died down over the past couple of years, a large number of people, including in the Syrian military, saying, what the hell were we fighting for? I mean, we're fighting to preserve an Alawite regime headed by a mafioso-style family that is enriching itself while we get poorer and poorer under the sanctions. We become a narco-trafficking state, and life hasn't improved. So what are we doing this for? And at the end of the day, it turns out that they weren't willing to fight for that regime.
And I would say, just briefly, the rest of the region gave Assad every opportunity to rejoin. I mean, they let him back into the Arab League very quickly, soon after the civil war sort of died down or started simmering. He was welcomed into regional capitals. He was brought back into, he was not a pariah state. Certainly in the region, he was not. And he was, to Richard's point, given every opportunity to do things differently, and just never did.
So now I want to ask you all to put on your prognostication hats and tell us what's going to happen next with Syria. You've all in one way or another said that this is complicated, this is difficult, and all smiled a bit about what's going on. So how are you feeling about the I guess, how are you feeling like the collapse of the regime is the wrong question. The right question is, what do you see happening next and why? And why don't we, to get a full reversal of order, why don't we go Marie, then Richard, then Brendan?
I knew you were going to start with me on the how we fix Syria.
You went last, and then you went second, and now you go first.
Well, there are a couple things we can look to. Richard alluded to one of them earlier. When he said that the new government regime, whatever word we're using, has been meeting with some of the old guard. They're talking about amnesty. They're talking about what to do with a variety, people who fought at sort of lower levels for the regime. They're talking about how to move forward in sort of the immediate term. There is a UN process. I will defer to my colleague Professor O'Leary, who has UN experience, to talk about whether he thinks the UN process has any chance of forging some path forward here for power sharing, and also, of course, an expert on power sharing. And I think a big question I have is what some of the other regional powers do. Iran feels quite threatened, quite beaten back on its back foot right now, to mix metaphors there. When the Israelis were able to assassinate senior terrorist leaders in Tehran, I think the Iranian regime feels under threat in a way they have not in a very, very, very long time. So I think what the Iranians do in the coming days and weeks vis-a-vis this new government in Syria will be very important to see, what the regional landscape will look like. And not that we have hope or don't hope. I think that's, as we said earlier, the wrong question. But I think there's a higher likelihood of sort of more societal breakdown, more violence, more fighting in Syria than not. Maybe I'll stop there and pause and let other people jump in. But that is where I sit today. Some of the things I'm looking at, some of the signposts.
Richard.
Yeah, I think anybody who has watched the Middle East, at least since the Arab Spring, can only be guardedly optimistic. I mean, the reality is we've seen signs of liberation and jubilation on the streets of Cairo and Sana'a, Yemen, and Tripoli, Libya, and things like that. And in a couple of cases,
when you put it like that.
Well, in a couple of cases, it led to civil war. In the cases of, Egypt, it led to a counter-revolution that imposed a dictatorship that was more oppressive than the Mubarak dictatorship that it replaced in the first place, and all this other stuff. So, but I think there are grounds to be guardedly optimistic. The optimistic, because Syrians have seen a lot of war for a very long time. And there is a certain exhaustion in that country, and a certain hope for a better day. And then also, some grounds to take seriously the kind of new line that the HTS, the group that was at the forefront of this move and to topple the government, has been saying just in the last couple of days, the kind of inclusive message they've been sent. I mean, it's worth observing on the guarded side of guardedly optimistic that HTS is the successor to Jabhat al-Nusra, which in turn is the successor for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's a foreign terrorist organization as designated by the United States. Al-Jilani, the nom de guerre of the leader of the rebel force, has a $10 million American bounty on his head. And so, this is not, the British Labour Party having stormed a power in Damascus or something like that. But, deeds are going to matter.
That was a different century, Richard.
I mean, deeds are going to matter. And, we should believe in redemption and conversion, but you have to, verify those things, not just trust them. And so I think there are grounds for guarded optimism, but unfortunately not euphoria.
Brandon.
So one of the questions Richard correctly raises is whether Islamists can learn and whether they can transform and liberalize themselves in practice. Do they have strong incentives to do so? I think they do in this case because of the scale of internal division. They have been successful very quickly, but they do not preside over a fully unified movement, to put it mildly. If we take the UN process, it's out of date. It's largely a UN security resolution tasked with dealing with the Islamic State. But it did commit itself to principles like the territorial integrity of Syria, currently comprehensively violated by multiple states, including our own, the independence of Syria, and so on, the usual talk from the UN Security Council. I can't see the Russians and Americans agreeing in the Security Council right now. What happens under a Trump administration is anybody's guess. That might create the circumstances, but the Trump administration and Trump himself are not nation builders, to put it mildly. And Trump has already declared his desire not to be involved. And personally, I think it would be a very good idea if America is only minimally involved in the possible reconstruction of Syria. Can we elaborate Richard's benign scenario? The benign scenario is there are multiple armed groups, and perhaps none of them can establish quickly a monopoly. And that might potentially create the social basis for creating a multi-ethnic, multinational federation. This was talked about at various junctures in the early part of the Syrian civil war. In my view, it still remains the optimal outcome. The UN process commits the parties to a transitional inclusive executive with elections to follow. I think it will be vital that those elections be conducted under some form of proportional representation, which is what the UN Electoral Assistance Unit normally recommends. The advantage of that is that the overwhelmingly large Sunni Arab majority, though we have to account for the fact that there's an enormous proportion of the population overseas at the moment, if they were unified behind one bloc, they could quite quickly establish a majoritarian democracy, taking no account of the importance of the minorities. If proportional representation is used, if the Sunni bloc splits, then I think we're into the world of possible coalition formation, which might help stabilize Syria. But there are so many negative things that we can easily point to. The fact that Turkey has very strong ambitions here and will want to see the Kurds at least put in a very tiny box, if not extinguished. That's a really open question. Erdogan has in the past had détente and rapprochement with the Kurds of Iraq, particularly with the Kurdistan Democratic Party led by the Barzanis. Could he shift in the case of Syria? It's very difficult because, like it or not, they are directly connected to the PKK, which both Turkey and the US officially call a terrorist organization, though the US supports them in Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces led by Kurds, because they believe correctly that the best opponents of the Islamic State in that part of Syria. So there's a Kurdish question to be solved. There's an intra-Arab question, intra-Muslim question to be solved. Will the Sunnis be generous, or will they want to carry out retribution? People have just been released from horrific jails. Not everybody who is in that jail is coming out as a liberal Democrat intent on multicultural pluralism. There will be lots and lots of people seeking retribution against what Alawite elites have done. Will the Alawites seek to establish their own autonomous entity out of fear? There are reports that Alawites are already heading for the Lebanese border. So these are the obvious negative possibilities. I think it's the optimistic scenario is one in which the Syrians, because of their grim recent past, have sufficient collective solidarity to hammer out a pact, and a pact that can work. If we continue down the benign road, precisely because the biggest grouping are Sunni Arabs, this will be well received in the Gulf states, who are the primary source of potential investment in the region. Although they were in bed with the Assad regime, they weren't in bed with it because it was anti-Sunni. They were in bed with it because they preferred him to radical Islam. Now they have to accommodate the fact that there are victorious Islamists in Syria, but maybe they're Islamists who have been partially educated by their own political struggle. That's the positive outlook. Remember the leader of the HTS's name. His name reflects the Golan Heights. So I don't think we're going to see emerge inside Syria some movement that is peaceably disposed towards Israel. So that conflict is going to remain. The Syrians have an established set of antipathies to Turkey because Turkey stole Alexandretta, which the Turks call Hatay province, in the years just before World War II in a very dubious process. It's not forgotten among Syrians. Erdogan, as I said earlier, has recently taken Afrin and expelled a significant swathe of the Kurdish population there. So the Syrians are bound to have territorial disputes with their neighbors. Making concessions in this area will make the relevant leaders appear weak and vulnerable to challenge. So it would be easy to multiply the challenges that they all face. Are there reasons to be optimistic? A small number, just a small number.
Well, on that cheery note, I want to turn to some of the questions that we have, including from a friend of Perry Worldhouse, Ambassador Vershbo, who asks, who states and then asks, while it would be a stretch for the Biden administration to claim victory, are there new opportunities for the U.S. and its allies to further diminish Russian and Iranian influence in the region and further complicate the Russians' campaign in Ukraine?
I can say a word about Iran, and then Richard, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
So I think that one of the first things the Trump administration is going to do is to finalize the Israeli-Saudi normalization. If they are able to get some sort of accommodation related to Gaza that the Saudis are okay with. And this is not directly related to Syria, but it is in large part continuing to move the Arab Gulf states toward Israel and continue to form this bloc against Iran. So I think that's one of the first things, and we saw this bear fruit militarily when Iran attacked Israel, and the Gulf states and other Arab states helped in the defense. So I think that it's not the exact question that the ambassador is asking, but when it comes to Iran, I think that Israel is ready to continue making moves in the Gulf. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said nice things about the future of Syria and being willing to work with them, but I completely agree with Professor O'Leary. I do not think he will find a willing partner on the Syrian side. I don't know how real his offers are either, but I think that continuing to isolate Iran will be happening in a number of different ways. And look, there's a new government in Iran as well, new-ish, who is navigating this as well. And there are early indications that the Trump administration might even be interested in doing some sort of deal with Iran. So it's not the exact question that was asked, but when it comes to Iran, that's what I'm looking for next. But Richard, I'll turn it over to you.
Richard?
Yeah, I mean, this is an intriguing. First of all, Sandy, great question as always. This is a intriguing possibility because if you look at the way that Russia and Israel and Hezbollah and Iran all intersected in Syria, that's changed dramatically. So the Syrians resupplied Hezbollah in Lebanon by shipping weapons across Syria into Lebanon. The Israelis have spent years bombing those convoys and the people doing that, and this was a constant effort. Part of the price of being able to operate above Syria in Russian-controlled airspace was a decent relationship between Israel and Russia. Part of the fallout from that was a little bit of hesitancy among the Israelis to do things like, support the Ukrainians militarily and all of that. Does this create some new opportunities, particularly if the wars in Lebanon and Hamas die down, for the Israelis to be more supportive of the Ukrainians because they don't need Russian acquiescence to their bombing campaign in Syria anymore? I don't know, but it's a possibility. And simply the interruption of Hezbollah supply lines across Syria is a good sign for anyone who would like to see the diminishment of Iranian influence in the region. I mean, Iran has had two major prongs of its offensive power projection in the region. It's proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and so on, Shia militias in Iraq. And the other is its ballistic missile inventory. Both of those have been significantly damaged and or rendered almost useless. And then Iran has had its air defenses eviscerated, and the taboo against striking in Iran now broken twice by the Israelis. So the Iranians have major problems on their hands, and the fall of this government in Syria is only going to add to that, which ultimately is a good thing.
Brendan, you want to jump in on this?
So I think it's possible, though unlikely, that an attack might take, or a series of attacks might take place on the Russian base. If you want to make it expensive for the Russians to retain their foothold in the region, that's what would be required. And the question would be, in whose interest locally would that be? I'm not sure. Unlikely to be the Alawites. So I suspect Russia is stretched as far as possible already as a result of what's happened. Iran is another matter, and I share the sentiment of wanting to see that regime both retreat and go. The main problem with handling Iran is it's on the verge of nuclear power, and this is the moment of maximum fear for the Iranians. And if you're under maximum fear, isn't that precisely the moment you decide to go nuclear? Where I think the Iranians can be pressurized, and this arises out of a point that Richard made, but I think he didn't finish the point. The Shia of Iraq are, in effect, quasi-clients of Iran at the moment. And one of the consequences of the victory of the rebels inside Syria will undoubtedly be, in whatever configuration, the strengthening of Sunni Arab power inside Syria. And that has repercussions for Iraq. The Sunnis of Syria and the Sunnis of Iraq are first cousins. Many of the tribes cross the border. And one can envisage a rekindling of the ambitions of Sunni Arabs to reacquire a significant stake in power inside Iraq. The trouble with that scenario is it goes entirely against the illusions of US policy that somehow they managed Iraq successfully and they put their people in place there, which in my view is not true. Can the US do an about turn and be pro-Sunni Arab and pro-Kurdish in Iraq as a way of weakening Iran's influence in Iraq? It would not be before time, in my view. It's possible. But I am concerned that there be an intelligent strategy towards Iran's possible step towards nuclear capacity. And intelligent is not a word I use about the incoming president of our country.
Can I just add one quick thing to that? Because we're about to enter a period that few probably thought was possible, which is, yeah, the Iranians are going to have significant incentives to go nuclear, which they can't do overnight. I mean, they've got close to enough fissile material, but weaponization, according to
that takes a little while.
Would take a year plus whatever. But it also may push them in the direction of negotiations. And so if the Trump administration wants an Iran nuclear deal, one that doesn't have the flaws of the Obama era nuclear deal, which of course they got out of and trashed and all these other things, they might be able to have it. I don't know whether they want a nuclear deal. But if ever there is a time for the Iranians to come to the table, it's when they're on their back like they are now. And so we'll see.
I think the incoming administration wants to try for a deal with Iran. And I think they want to broaden it beyond the nuclear issue, which was always one of the criticisms of the Obama deal. I don't think there's a lot of appetite in Iran for that, but there are signs coming out of both sides here, the new Trump administration and the Iranians, that there might be some appetite. And look, Richard, they might even not get a better deal, but try and say it's a better deal. I mean, this is a classic thing we've seen from from some of the same folks who are going back into the Trump administration. But I am seeing more signs than I ever have before from the Trump team that they are interested in seeing if there is a path to a deal to be had with Iran.
All right, I want to move on to the question of the Kurds. We have two different questions in the chat asking varieties of A, what's next for the Kurds, or B, is this a moment where the Kurds might have a shot to gain a state given the instability in the region? Brendan, you are a resident Kurd expert, so why don't we start with you and go around the horn?
So I don't think there's any immediate prospect of a sovereign, independent Kurdish state, either in Syria or in Syria and Iraq. That would require a further collapse of the Iraqi state, and it would require external support from some major power for the Kurds. And speaking normatively, regrettably, that's not available. What is available for the Kurds is to negotiate a form of territorial autonomy inside Syria. They could have just a distinct settlement for themselves, though I think it would be better for them if Syria as a whole properly federalized so that the arrangements that the Kurds had could be incorporated into a wider umbrella. The Kurds remain divided both in Syria and Iraq. Often Kurds are their own worst enemies. The movement for independence in Kurdistan in 2017 was fundamentally defeated by internal divisions among the Kurds, particularly caused by the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which is prominent in the city of Sulaymaniyah. The Kurds of Syria historically were immensely divided. They had something like 18 political parties before 2010. I lost count, lost my ability to memorize the various parties. So one of the extraordinary things about the last period of conflict has been the mobilization of most Kurds behind the Syrian Democratic Forces. Whether that will remain the case after a period of peace and calm, if Syria gets that, is anyone's guess. But I do think this is an opportunity for the Kurds of Syria to seek out allies, both among the other minorities inside Syria and among the more secular and liberal Sunni Arabs, who do exist in significant numbers. But maybe most of those are in exile. I'm not sure of the facts on the ground there.
All right, Marie, Richard, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I mean, the Kurds have been waiting for an independent state since the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, and they're no closer 104 years later today than they were then. So no state in the offing, but as Brendan said, the possibility of some autonomy and things like that. You know, the issue with the Kurds, whether in Iraq or Turkey or Iran for that matter, and in Syria, is been the at least perceived interests of outside powers in their disposition. That's not going to go away. It's not going to go away. We know the Turkish perspective on these things, but also the American perspective, which is that we don't want to see a resurgence of ISIS in northern Syria, and the Kurds are a key force in helping us to beat them back. And so I think you're likely to see the Kurds still both have to kind of navigate whatever they're trying to accomplish domestically, but also these relationships with the outside powers that are not going to turn off almost no matter what political dispensation happens in Syria.
So we've got a couple questions asking about Syria's borders. We've one person that asks, what's to become of the Syrian military forces that poured into Iraq a couple of days ago? Another person asking about the Jordan's border with Syria. And then, of course, there's the Israeli military, which has sort of moved across the Golan. So I'm wondering if each of you could maybe take a minute and talk about what's going on around in that border area, maybe, trying in particular to hit on this question we haven't talked about yet, that being, where is Assad's military today?
They're not in uniform, that's for sure. So, I mean, from what we could see, it was one of these standard dissolutions of the military as people took off their uniforms, changed into plain clothes, and either went home. Some tried to go across the borders into neighboring countries. But, when you're in the military of the side that loses, and there's guys with guns who come in and say we're in charge now, then it doesn't usually pay to just show up and say, hey, I'm on the other team and I'm here to help. So, um, there is, as we saw in Iraq and in some of these other countries, there's going to be a question about the reconstitution of the Syrian military. Under whose authority do the people come back in? Is there a, even beyond the military, is there a de-Baathification kind of, already the new regime, so to speak,
That's a
has
phrase
been.
I've not heard in a long time.
Right, but I mean, welcome back to the future, right? Because and the new regime has already sent some messages that are quite inclusive and effectively saying that they're going to retain the structure of the state, and they have not started reprisals. It doesn't look like against former regime military and all of this, but these are very early days, and some of those hard policy decisions. I mean, it's hard when families have had people disappear into Assad slaughterhouses for decades, and really a traumatized country that has to potentially live side by side with people who were the enforcers of that nightmare. So that all remains to be seen. On the Israeli side, the Israelis have moved in and established a buffer zone along their border. They moved across into the UN buffer zone, and on the other side of Mount Hermon, the Israelis have one side, the Syrians generally have another, and they say this will be temporary, which I think is believable. They don't know who's going to be in charge of Syria and with what force, which is why they're also taking steps to destroy the military infrastructure of Syria. And as Brendan pointed out, Jolani is the Arabic formulation of Golan, which can't inspire Israeli leaders with huge optimism about the intentions of their new neighbor. So, the Israelis, I think, are taking prudent steps to try to build some space between their border and where Syrian forces would be able to be active.
So a regime has collapsed. And when a regime collapses, one of the attributes of statehood goes, the full control over your borders. We have refugee movements in both directions, the return of some and some exiting. It'll be some time before it's clarified how the new and emergent regime manages to control its borders. I don't expect any immediate move by the HTS to go towards establishing territorial sovereignty over Kurdish areas. I think they'll move prudently in that respect. I think they will be keen to try and demonstrate as much as possible to the Syrian populations that they are not Turkish clients. But that will mean insisting on significant Turkish withdrawal from parts of the north. Whether that will happen is another matter. So we're in for a period of very complex constitutional reconstruction at best, and we're in for a failed state at worst.
Marie?
I want to say just a word about the Israel border question. If you think at the way Prime Minister Netanyahu is looking at I think Richard is right that it is prudent what the Israeli military is doing in the buffer zone and the areas that they do not know who will be controlling what's on the other side of it. I do not share his optimism that it is not permanent. And I look at this from, when I was in Israel in June, 6 months ago, what we heard from Israelis across the political spectrum was that this physical space was shrinking where Israelis could live because they had evacuated a lot of the north because of the conflict with Hezbollah. A lot of the Gaza envelope areas have been evacuated away from Gaza since October 7th and because of the ongoing war. And in those last 6 months, they have returned many Israelis to the north because of their deal, even though it's a tenuous one with Hezbollah. They are, I think, maybe at some point getting close to finishing their operations in Gaza. They have expanded into the buffer zone with Syria, and there are open talks about annexing the West Bank. And they have an incoming administration that has appointed an ambassador, Mike Huckabee, who has a very specific apocalyptic sort of Christian Zionist view, particularly of the West Bank and of, greater Israel and what that should look like. And so in 6 months, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who today was in court testifying in his own trial, the area had just been shrinking. And now, even in those 6 months, in a variety of ways, in large part because of Prime Minister Netanyahu's aggressive action against Hezbollah, against Iran, against other proxies in the region, they are in an expansive moment. And so when I think about borders in the region and what Israel's doing, that's how I'm looking at that piece of the conflict.
So that you're describing an expand to survive justification. That, of course, means in the long run, let's imagine that the Iranian threat is significantly diminished. I think it would be highly optimistic to assume that the Arab populations then will treat Israel as an ally. They will return to their empathy for the Palestinians, and they'll want those questions settled. So to Israeli expansionists, I would caution, be careful what you wish for.
All right, we are just about out of time here, so I hope that everyone will join me in thanking Brendan, Marie, and Richard for lending us their expertise today. And thanks to everybody for joining us for the World Today at Perry World House. We really appreciate it. If you want to watch this tomorrow or send it to your friends, hi, Mom, it will be up on YouTube tomorrow. And you can fire away. You follow us on all the socials at Perry World House, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day.